Hello, and welcome to this new session of Emergency by Exogram at Ars Electronica. My name is Manuel Freire. I'm General Coordinator of Exogram, and I'm going to introduce this session, this new panel. Before I do so, I wish to welcome you to what is the launching of a new season of Rencontre Interdisciplinaire of Exogram for 2021-2022. And this season will go on until June 2022, so there will be lots more to come after this event. On this panel, different perspectives and practices will guide us to reflect on how the interactions between urban environments, technology, and communities are increasingly dependent upon space telecommunication infrastructures, although these are out of sight and out of reach. What techniques and cohabitation strategies can be developed to assess and subvert their materiality and impact in the social and built environment? Departing from the premise that the right to the city is a fundamental human right, this roundtable explores strategies to best exercise this right in the context of the urbanization of space technology. By engaging with the impact of planetary thinking at the urban level, participants in this panel imagine and invent possibilities of aesthetic, ecological, and civic engagement that challenge the urban impact of space telecommunication infrastructures. The researchers in this session will take us through site-specific urban interventions, case studies, visual provocations, and the various material forms that space technology takes in the city to reflect on alien modes of aesthetic engagement and creative adaptation of the urban environment. So participants in this panel in order of presentation are Lee Wilkins, doctoral candidate at the University of Toronto, Alice Jarry, Exogram co-investigator and assistant professor at Concordia University, Bernard Fouin, astrophysicist and professor of earth sciences at VU Amsterdam in the Netherlands and director of the Art Moon Mars and the Moon Gallery Foundation, Philippe Vandal, student at Concordia University and also Exogram student member, Isabelle Boucher, doctoral student, Concordia University, Exogram student member, followed by Marie-Pierre Boucher, Exogram collaborator member, assistant professor at the University of Toronto, Emiliano Gandolfi, urbanist and independent curator, and Guillaume Pascal, doctoral student at UQAM, Exogram student member. Thank you, and you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Manuel. We're thrilled to be here today. This roundtable, first, before we start, I would like to thank Exogram and Ars Electronica, and also Marc-André and Jean-François for their amazing technical support today. We're very happy to be in person. So this roundtable is the first event of a project that we're launching today entitled Outer Space and the City, Cohabitation Strategies with Interplanetary Infrastructures. Based at the University of Toronto and funded by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council in Canada. The project is co-directed by myself and Alice Jarry, with the participation of our dear collaborators that we have online, Bernard Fouin and Emiliano Gandolfi. We also have another collaborator, Pierre-Louis Patoine, professor of American literature in Paris, who could not be here with us today. So, with this project, we propose to engage with the city as an analog for outer space in habitation and vice versa. So that is, with outer space in habitation as an analog for earthly habitation. So let me start with two clips. The first one from Out of the Present, the first one from CBC documentary Earthrise, the story of the photo that changed the world, and the second one from Out of the Present, a documentary edited by Andrei Ujika. Le son sort pas. J'avais du son tout à l'heure.
In color, Face the Nation, a spontaneous and unrehearsed news interview with the Apollo 8 astronauts. Colonel Frank Borman, the command pilot of the mission. Captain James Lovell, who has logged more hours in space than any other man, and Lieutenant Colonel William Anders, for whom the trip to the moon was his first voyage into space.
You three gentlemen are the first men to escape from the Earth, so to speak. Is there, I'm sure you're going to be asked this over and over again, but I think everybody wonders about it. Is there some kind of a psychological wrench when you see the Earth actually receding, when you're alone in the universe and the only spot in the whole visible universe is an Earth which is so distant that it looks like, as I believe one of you said, like a quarter or something of that sort. Is there some kind of a feeling which might seriously affect people who are not like you, trained, experienced? In other words, if you had a passenger aboard who were not so busy, would he really feel a wrench?
Хорошо, когда вы летели, тогда был Советский Союз, Горбачев был у власти, в вашем городе Сергей Крыгоров был Ленинград, теперь, значит, ваш город Санкт-Петербург. Ну вот из всех этих перемен, что больше впечатляет вас, что вас больше волнует?
Не слышу этого вопроса.
Когда вы улетели, это был тогда СССР, был Ленинград, а сегодня это Петербург. И, кроме того, был еще Горбачев у власти, а сегодня Ельцин. Что, скажите нам, какая самая большая перемена для вас? Что вас больше всего удивляет?
Это трудно сказать, еще много изменений произошло. Но, может быть, больше всего удивляет то, что сначала Земля была темная, потом она белая, наступила зима, было лето, а сейчас снова цветает. Может быть, это самое такое впечатляющее изменение, которое видно отсюда из космоса.
So we already know that space is a continuation of our earthly geopolitical and cultural systems and problems. So on May 19, 1991, Soviet cosmonaut Sergei Krikalev went to the Mir station for what was supposed to be a 6-month mission. But because of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, he could not be brought back on Earth he could be brought back on Earth only a year later. So we see that space activities are a national Earth-based affair. But moving beyond nationalism and borders and paying attention to the reactions here, we may wonder if astronauts and cosmonauts are the most suited people to help us reinvent the way we live in both space and on Earth. So we may also see this as an invitation to take part of the discussion, and this is what we are trying to do today. So, to contextualize the project, today's most important global telecommunication infrastructures are located in the geostationary orbit, where satellites control most communication on Earth. One satellite in the GEO can see 42% of the Earth, while 3 satellites can cover the whole globe. For geographer Christy Collis, the GEO is the most important contemporary real estate. A central issue with these space telecommunication infrastructures is that while they facilitate most communication on Earth, they're not only out of sight, they're out of reach. The GEO is located 32,000 kilometers above the Earth's surface. So the premise of this group is that while space telecommunication infrastructures make most communication possible on Earth, the physical, technical, and economic limitations imposed by their accessibility act as hindrances to the possibility of informed civic engagement and creative adaptation. So as we see here in the slide by Lisa Rootfran, our dependence on these infrastructures is so important that scholars like Lisa suggest that the end of the satellite age could mean the end of the modern global age as we know it. So as she reminds us, we rely on satellite for a number of activities which we take for granted, including ATM machines, domestic cell phone networks, military interventions, weather monitoring, and so on. So what kind of tools, we ask, do we need to develop for the critical study of interplanetary infrastructures so that they are not left without critical engagement? Our proposition is to examine the material forms that space technology take in the city and to find ways to creatively adapt it. So as Manu explained, we depart from David Harvey's suggestion that the right to the city is the fundamental human right, and we're trying to see how to best exercise that right in the context of the urbanization of space technology. So our shared objective today is to break down the utilitarian relations sustained by the commercial sector towards the creation of new forms of collective engagement with space and urban infrastructures, and to provoke new relations and interactions with the built environment. So our journey will take the form of a flight, one that departs somewhere between the city and the interplanetary, and which moves within and across the media infrastructure that condition, enable, and foreclose these flights. We will navigate from the Earth to the moon and back in the city. We will fly above, below, and beneath to offer situated positions that refuse what Donna Haraway has called the gut trick, which often comes with overviews that claim to be neutral. So we will also fly transversally, moving from atmospheric to community strata, seeking to bridge environmental and community concerns into new assemblage. So we're trying to accept the invitation of David Valentine, an anthropologist of space, of outer space, who invites us, and I quote, to resist the conceptualization of the future as an empty signifier, able to represent all the fantasies of modernist futures, but with none of the material consequences social scientists assign to modernist projects. So the first section now, we're gonna have one first section and we're gonna take a 5-minute break and then another section. So the first section will address interplanetary concerns as eco-objects. Moving between urban and moon dust and space imagery, we ask, what does the materiality of space technology tell us about urban and interplanetary inequalities related to pollution and environmental degradation? Looking specifically at space imagery and keeping in mind what Wendy Chun warns us against when she writes, computers have fostered both a decline in and a frenzy of visual knowledge. Opaque yet transparent, incomprehensible yet logical, they reveal that the less we know, the more we show or are shown. So we also ask, what kind of space iconography do we rely on? What kind of space iconography are we reproducing and with what implications? And finally, what kinds of new imagery of the art and new regimes of visibility can we invent? So let's move to Lee's capsule.
There are 2 geostationary operational environmental satellites orbiting Earth, serving as weather satellites. GOES-16 provides a view centered on the Americas, with high-resolution spatial and temporal imagery through 16 spectral bands at visible and infrared wavelengths. Imaging satellites like GOES are responsible nearly entirely for how we view and understand Earth. Images of Earth are nearly always defined and delineated by borders, nations, and politically or socially significant. Most of us will never see Earth like this, and so we rely on this imagery to make sense of our place in the universe. As Jody Berland says in North of Empire, our social identity is rooted in place as well as discourse. Place is composed of a constellation of resources, habits, memories, narratives, choices, power relations, transit systems, landscapes, shared communicative understandings, and events. Baudrillard uses the term satellization to refer to the way systems of control determine and reflect the social order as a strategy for planetary control. Satellites create and control our visions of the Earth in what Lisa Parks calls televisual images, squeezed through mechanisms like weather reports, military imagery, political or governmental agendas. Telescopes, such as the Spitzer Space Telescope, view outward into our solar system and beyond. They collect similar bands of infrared and ultraviolet light, gases and plumes of dust, like these 3 different renderings of the Orion Nebula. It would be false to say that these images aren't tethered to Earth's bodily politics still. As Lisa Parks explains, the further we reach out into the unknown, the closer our visions are tied to our perception of Earth, as we are filling in more unknown voids of knowledge. Why are we looking out into the universe? And for what are we looking, specifically, materially? Defamiliarizing ourselves with images of Earth can allow us some space to untangle the politics embedded within satellite imagery. This capsule is a prompt to view our familiar Earth in an unfamiliar way, as we view the rest of the solar system. By following this line of questioning, we're able to imagine division, allocation, and forces of capitalism enacting upon stellar phenomena where borders have not yet been drawn around their resources. These, for example, are images of Canada, as we might view it as a celestial phenomenon. Human-created borders often follow lines of climate or resources that can be applied even without the explicit lines of country borders. Even by viewing the Earth as a cloud of light and material spectra, we're also viewing the pull of capitalism, materials, and bodily politics of people accessing them. This is a provocation of what Earth might look like as an unknown, and how we can begin to unknow and untangle the Earth. As media theorists have long argued, simply removing the contextually political elements from the image doesn't separate it from the larger systems at play that produce imagery of Earth and the universe. The viewing of a celestial body, our own or elsewhere, is always embedded within systems of power, and the struggle of individual bodies for resources.
Hi everyone. Well, thanks Lee for this fantastic video capsule. This short presentation is entitled Dust Tracking and Precarious Infrastructure from the Moon to the Metropolitan Highway in Montreal, Canada. So I ain't going to do much more dusting after I leave here, ever, said astronaut Gene Cernan in a series of debrief sessions following Apollo 17. Harrison Schmitt stated that dust was going to be the most pressing environmental problem for future missions, both inside and outside habitats. There is no wind on the moon, no erosion, and grains produced by micrometeorites remain extremely abrasive, glass, razor sharp. The absence of atmosphere also causes regolith, the soil topside layer, to be bombarded by the sun's charged particles, causing dust to float and levitate like static cling on clothing. Important dusty knowledge emerged from low-tech and serendipitous discoveries and inventions, such as the DDE, or dust detector experiments, designed by Brian O'Brien in the 60s. The DDE consisted of 3 tiny solar cells mounted on a box the size of a soap bar, and as dust settled on the cells, their power output would drop, providing a record of dust accumulation on the moon. Considered the least impressive component of the Apollo science package, the DDE and its further tape data recovery in 2006 proved to be instrumental in understanding dust behaviors such as sunrise-driven storm, shifting electrostatic charges, and dust levitation. Had the DDE data been accessible back then, perhaps astronauts would have tried to dust their spacesuit differently. Indeed, dust erodes sensitive equipment and clogs a mechanism beyond repair. Lunar soil contains several types of silica-based materials, and if the Apollo crew reported lunar hay fever, on Earth silica-based mineral dust are also known to be toxic. In the same way, studies with moon dust simulant showed that particles could cause a wide range of issues, from irritation, bronchitis, to permanent DNA damage. If breeding poses serious health hazard to future airless environment dwellers, a renewed corporate and governmental interest in prospecting water, minerals, and precious resources foster research in smart materials and technologies able to harvest and harness lunar dust and increase habitability. 3D printing regolith for habitat and protective shells, lunar dust-busting paints, procedure to extract oxygen out of dust, just to name a few examples. As moon dust challenges space infrastructure and human survival, certain cities' infrastructure propose equally harsh environments producing residues such as particles, dust, gases generated by transport and industrial activity. Atmospheric pollution on Earth has the same impact than on the moon, killing an estimated of 7 million people worldwide every year. These different extractive settings parallel and reveal various forms of precarity, the fragility of techno-scientific models and economic growth dependent on human control over its environment, the metabolic processes and porous boundaries between living things and their milieus, and pressing questions of socio-environmental justice linked to the accessibility to a healthy environment. Atmospheric toxicity, something felt although invisible, reveals the social, political, and technological contours of harmful practices. Built in the late 50s, the Trans-Canadian Highway, or the Metropolitan Highway, crosses Canada, passes through the island of Montreal, and divides its north and south, highlighting contrasted socioeconomic and demographic areas with variable air quality For instance, the Saint-Michel neighborhood versus Town Mont-Royal, or Montreal East with its oil refineries, such as Suncor, and the Pointe-aux-Trembles sector, where the industrial activity increases the prevalence of pulmonary diseases. Echoing the DDE and how these simple devices and DIY forms of engagement disclose crucial site-specific information about dust behavior, how can the tracking and harvesting of neglected and peripheral atmospheric processes produce new forms of engagement with urban environments? For example, sweeping the highway dust, dust busting the highway. So how to follow dusty connections and see what they reveal or foreclose in the city. Bordering areas of the highway. This is supposed to change.
Houston, we have a problem.
Houston, keynote problem. So I'll just continue. So how to follow dusty connections and see what they reveal or foreclose in the city. So bordering areas of the highway show contested terrain where nature, industrial activity, and human collectivities co-evolve. The Nomad Kit is an ongoing prototype, portable, connected, and powered by solar energy. It measures fine particle levels, PM, volatile organic compound, VOC, CO2 level, and temperature. So the kit looks at urban residue and how they form with air, bio, geo, anthropo assemblage that unfolds across different scales. Beyond capturing data, the kit develops new modes of aesthetic and critical vigilance between urban atmospheres, the city, and the body. So through their persistence, urban dust operates along paths that are difficult to reduce to the status of passive matter. In 1966, in the midst of the Apollo program and the year the DDE experiments were designed, anthropologist Mary Douglas wrote that dirt was matter out of place. How do we make the invisible tangible? How do we address both the effective and affective dimension of matter, both on space and on Earth, and create new sensory experiences with things that are by definition unwanted? So these were my opening questions.
Thank you. So we'll move to Bernard. Yes.
So what a timing today. We have a crew that just came back from the moon. They were on the moon base, isolated for 1 week without a window, and they just landed today, just in time for this event of outer space in the city. And we are going to provoke you. Should we put a city on the moon? Is that utopia, dystopia? We are doing it. They are preparing it. So let me introduce you fast, the team.
So I am Damien, I come from France.
Loud, yes.
I'm Antonio and I come from Italy.
I'm Julia and I come from Italy. Hi, I'm Rowan, I come from England. Hi, I'm Pauline and I come from France. I am Micheline and I come from Belgium.
Yes, so you see, we are international, we are Human Mars, and here we are from a control center in Poland, and we just sent another batch of astronauts to the moon. And so now we have prepared a presentation for you with some visuals to tell you what we could do on the moon. So if I can share my presentation, yes, I'll do it now. Please enable me to share a few slides that we have prepared for you. Yes, and so now we have actually sent already some probes to the moon. I sent myself. Please allow my screen. Yes, excellent. So we have opened the gate of communication between the moon and the Earth. So let's explore that. Yes, Ars Electronica. Here we come. Do you see us? Yes. Okay, so that's us, our presentation. Yeah, so we are all team, and we started some 10 years ago a program, Human Mars, where we are training Earth citizens. You know, we are all astronauts of planet Earth. You know, they are astronauts, you are astronaut, and we can move beyond the Earth. And so we have done a number of simulations where we test instruments, we analyze data, we try to go to places on Earth that are very similar to the Moon and Mars. And here now we are in a Polish observatory, and they just returned to the Moon there. So we went to the Moon with a little probe, and for that we can analyze on the Moon the history of the Earth, how it was bombarded, but we are also looking at places on the Moon where we could set a city or a moon village. And this could be the pole of the Moon. And we found some places which are super cold with ice, and others which are in eternal sunlight. And de facto, we have started to put a robotic village on the Moon. Our Chinese friends, they landed in 2013, they deployed a rover, and also they put on a rover and a lander on the far side of the Moon, and even a mission to return samples from the Moon last year. So we have put a roadmap for you, going to the Moon in orbit, putting a village of robots, and then going with humans together with robots to use some resources, but then to establish a global community, but that benefits the whole Earth. So that's why we call it a moon village, in a sense of a global village, McLuhan global village that connects the Earth and the Moon for the benefits of everybody. And you see, we are there. We have brought our astronauts, we have built a lander, and we are testing in places that look like the Moon what we could do there. We can do it for science. We can also develop some technologies. So we went to the Etna volcano, for instance, with some intelligent rovers, and actually we returned this year just after the pandemic restriction, and we could even witness a beautiful series of eruptions on Etna, like it was 4 billion years ago on the Moon. So by research in analogs of the Moon and Mars, in Etna, in Hawaii, in the Utah Desert, in the Atacama Desert, in Iceland, we can train ourselves to understand better the science of the Moon and Mars, but also test technical systems in the extreme, but also see how we could use resources and even settle some bases there, and even after villages or cities for all. Actually, we just returned in July from a place near Etna where we explored Mars on Earth with a team. And so 10 years ago, we started a program, Your Moon Mars, where we locked down some young professionals like them for 1 or 2 weeks, and you see how they would perform in a restricted environment, in isolation, and they do research, they demonstrate instruments, they learn how to live in a very restricted place, and also the human factors of extreme conditions, sleep deprivation. I think that you have experienced that, and also international environment. But now they are back on Earth, and they are going to tell their story. So we have also campaign where we go outside and we simulate what would be a Martian landscape. So to put EVA suit, this is what we'll have to do also on the Moon and Mars. So it's not very hospitable, but later we will build a gigantic dome, and then we'll be able to live in a pressurized environment. 1/6 gravity will be able to fly on the Moon. And we do a program where we organize Your Moon Mars workshop. And so that's in ESTEC, at the European Space Agency. We had also the pleasure to organize some workshop in Concordia and in McGill in the past with some of our friends like Marie-Pierre. But now we have also built a base on the Moon. The Moon analog, that's in Hawaii. We have a self-sustainable base using only solar power, also completely autonomous, and where we are training to go permanently and sustainably on the Moon. And the surrounding is really looking like the Moon. Here you see the astronaut exploring the lava field. Here some geology students are taking data for their master research. And now we are here in the Analog Astronaut Training Center in Poland, where we also can teach you how to launch rocket, how to go dive, how to do a skydive or launch a balloon. And this is to make you all train to become a real citizen astronaut. So we had some simulation where we started where we logged a crew 2 weeks, and you see they are all smiling because they are full of hope. And you can see after when they return from the moon, they are still smiling. They are exhausted. They didn't sleep last night on the cruise back to the Earth. But we feed them with plant grown, and they have to take care of them. And we even had a workshop today. They had to present their result in this observatory, Queen Jadwiga Observatory. We were also celebrating today Yuri Gagarin. And so we had to walk for 108 minutes in the landscape on the new Gagarin trail, the duration of what was Gagarin flight. We have also some campaign in Iceland. It's a great place to simulate the moon, Mars. It has also ice and volcano. And we do some tests to deploy an habitat in the lava tube. And this habitat was built in Vancouver, actually by a School of Design, and we have tested it. But also we are working together with Art Moon Mars platform, and we are trying to bring the first museum of art to the moon, and we test it in all our environment. It's a piece of art which is only 10 centimeter size with 100 pieces artifact, and we want to be the first museum of art to the moon. But we are going to launch the first version in February to the International Space Station. So you're all welcome to join us for bringing our message to the future generation there. We have also formed an academy where we try to capitalize on this background of space training, physical, theoretical, experimental. We also go to the public, so don't be surprised if one day you see us landing in your city. Here we were landing in the middle of The Hague in front with our lander and with some astronauts. And we go all over the world. We have members from all countries and from all ages, as you can see. And we had a panel where at the International Astrophysical Congress, next one will be in Dubai in October, and next year in Paris. I hope all to see you. So in short, we are trying to work out to make the reality of the moon village, so a permanent human and robotic presence on the moon, but for the benefit of everybody on Earth. And so we try to sort some technology challenge to get there, operate, communicate, survive, move, exploit resources, look at the partnership between robot and human, but we want mostly to listen to users like all of you that could tell us how we could expand our civilization in for the benefit of everybody, also living on a double planetary system. So that's what we are working on now, and you are all welcome to join us. We welcome all disciplines in our simulations, and so let's expand the Earth village to the moon, and we invite you to join us for this endeavor. So now I stop sharing this presentation and give the floor to all my moon base and to wave at you returning from the moon. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
There are two geostationary
This is an illegal, toxic landfill taking over a forest on Kanizatake lands. Filled with industrial and construction waste from other cities, including Montreal, it overflowed and nearby residents are now worried that their drinking and groundwater has been contaminated.
How does satellite imagery shape the way we engage with waste and complex socio-environmental issues such as this one? The computerization of environmental monitoring and land management on a global scale impact the life of people living at the limits of spaces designed to be contaminated by urban life. Focusing only on visual data obfuscate multisensorial materialities, such as the experiences and relationships that communities have with their surroundings, erasing difference in complexity and stratifying layers of existences to be included or excluded.
Waste is a process, something that gains consistency while becoming alongside satellite technologies in a material realm upheld by visuality and ocular centrism. By siting and monitoring landfills with remote sensing technologies, we create environments as sinks while legitimizing our current waste production. We Montrealers are interestingly now being asked to reduce it since our main landfill just north of the city is getting full and we haven't found another sink to pollute yet.
Environmental monitoring through satellite imagery and land classification has developed alongside the pursuit of extractive practices. The ontological flattening of reality that Montreal-based GHG-SAT enables through colored renderings of methane levels reinforces the trend by issuing sociocultural and ongoing geopolitical stresses, proposing instead eco-imperialist solutions for mostly non-Western landfills.
Whereas GHG-SAT's pulse interface homogenizes space through methane emissions, forensic architecture's case studies affix different positionalities, experiences, and relations through complex multidimensional renderings of ongoing geopolitical conflicts. What would usually slip between spatial resolutions and pixelation are the cultural and sociopolitical relationalities that materializes these visualities.
By doing so, forensic architecture is countering the hegemonic mapping complex and offers ways of reappropriating spatial and visual technologies for activist purposes. DIY satellite imagery projects are blurring the rigid cartographic expectations of land classification, multispectral image analysis, and tile rendering of territories and lands.
Through our remote sensing research on Montreal's waste and pollution management, remote sensing became a key technology to picture the externality of its material flows, where suburbs are holding the burden of the city's abject mattering. Montreal's various terraforming projects, hiding former landfills and dumps under green infrastructures, are maneuvers to conceal the environmental repercussions of our lifeways, for which remote sensing and satellite imagery can still address its current extent.
Bernard, merci à ton équipe aussi. Votre enthousiasme est contagieux. En tout cas, ici, on est tous contents, on a envie d'y aller avec vous. Sorry, I need to speak English. Okay, so I was just saying that
we can also organize some simulation in an habitat in Canada, so we want to expand that all over the world. But
we'd love to do that. So your enthusiasm is contagious. This is what I was saying. So just before we engage with the discussion, so the way we'll do is that we'll do like a short question period with the participants, do the second part, and then we'll have a more global discussion. So if participants online have questions, do not hesitate to post them in the chat, and Manu will check them out and we'll bring them in. And also don't be afraid to ask Bernard very difficult scientific questions. I think it's a great opportunity for us to use him. So we'll go first around here. So I think Isabelle had a question for Lee.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, yeah. Well, I thought your capsule really beautifully encapsulated the process of defamiliarization you're talking about, and I was really just curious about how you go about defamiliarizing. If are you still using satellite imagery? Is there something to salvage in satellite imagery or space media in general? And yeah, I would just love to know more about your process.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question and sort of like a chicken and egg challenge. Like it's really hard to familiarize yourself with something that we have really limited access to. So I wouldn't say I necessarily have like a solution, as it were, but I think it's important to like take a critical lens to the types of technologies that, again, present themselves as neutral or as scientific, and at least ask the question, and then maybe like prompt other ways of viewing. But there's definitely like a barrier because not only are like we are limited in like producing technologies that can capture this imagery, and we're also limited in like the amount of images that get filtered to us. So yeah.
Well, thank you. I think Alice had a question for you, Bernard.
Well, I think my question kind of bridges Lee's capsule and your presentation, Bernard, because something that struck me looking at Lee's video was this question of placemaking. Placemaking as some kind of qualitative texture that you can't have like looking from above. And my first question for Lee was like, okay, if you had to create like place-making experience artifact and interventions somewhere on Earth, or focus differently on the question of place-making, like in space, what would it be? And then, Bernard, I saw your presentation with your team, and you always imagine, well, you have the kind of like, you know, preconceived idea of like space as a big void and isolation, but what I saw was like fantastic methods of cooperations between persons. So I think that my questions is for both of you. What kind of place-making strategies can we develop in space?
I'll let Bernard go first.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah. Lee, you want to start?
Well, Lee, you want to answer first, or?
As you like.
I don't know, I'm sorry. Maybe Bernard can go first.
Well, Bernard, you can go first.
You can go first, yeah.
Oh. Is he stuck? So maybe Lee, you can go first.
Yeah, I think the idea of placemaking is really interesting because like often we don't have the agency to make our own places, and the places we make are defined by structures of power. So I think a lot of like my work and my thinking is like how we can start more from the bottom up to think about the places that we want to make instead of the places that we're kind of given or the places that are delineated for us. And I think it's an interesting opportunity when we think about interplanetary or like making places in space. Like in some theory, they are unclaimed spaces waiting to be made. But in reality, that's not always necessarily a true thing. So.
Do we have Bernard back or? No, he's
no?
gone.
Lost Bernard.
So maybe he's lost in the void, right? So
yeah, sorry.
In the end.
No more place.
No place for him.
Yeah,
I
out
have
of place.
I have a question for. Oops, sorry. I have a question for you, Alice. So, looking at this particular matter of dust that has very special qualities of not only being unwanted, like you said, but it's also volatile. It travels. It takes on different states, can be airborne or it can set on the ground. And so I understand this is a new method, a new approach that you're taking. What are you expecting to collect, or what can you foresee that this data is going to bring you? Maybe expectations based on the case studies in space, but also based in this very earthly settings that you're examining. What do you foresee?
Well, Philippe can jump in if he's part of the project. It's a collaborative project, part of a broader research project. But I mean, the thing is that like looking at the ground and dust is looking at some form of like unwanted and contaminated material. And you know, dust settles, and then it creates clouds, sediments. It has kind of different states of being. And the little tube that you saw, well, is part of like an ongoing series of prototype, where it's not like, of course we gather data, but like there's tons of data about air quality in different cities. It already exists. It's also a kind of modus operandi to engage with space and to engage with different border areas or filtration areas where air is a marker of socioeconomic and demographic divide. If you go like near the highway in Saint Michel, well, it's a gray area. There's no trees. If you go in Mont Royal in Montreal, well, it borders the highway, but it's super green and the air is great. So to look at these kind of contested sites of where air quality differs, we're kind of not expecting to get the most precise data. That's more a way to document the site with pictures, with materials, and after that it will translate into different forms of installation, workshop with citizens, engaging with the city of Montreal. So there's like different steps to this project, and so we just showed the mini first ones. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
So I'm just wondering, yeah, go ahead.
Moi j'avais une question pour Bernard qui a l'air d'être de retour.
Oui, Bernard is back.
Je peux la poser en français.
Oui, puis on va la traduire après.
Enfin, plutôt pour son équipe même. Ma question, c'était je me demandais ce que ressentaient ces spationautes à la fois d'être localisés sur Terre, mais situés sur la Lune. Comment ça se passe pour eux, cette espèce d'ambivalence?
Bernard will just translate in English first, so he's asking.
Okay. Yes. Okay. So
he's asking how do they feel that they're like they're on Earth, but they're like kind of like located in a location that is kind of outside of the Earth at the same time. Well, you know, this is.
Yes. Okay. Yes. So the first question, there was a question about placemaking.
Yes.
And the placemaking, clearly, we have already surveyed the moon. And actually, I surveyed it with my own baby, a baby spacecraft launched in 2003 to monitor the moon. So we know from above where you want to go. Now we want to go to the next step in the surface to learn how we could pick a place and live there, exploit the dust, the resources as it was discussed, but also learn how to live there. And so one question is for my astronauts that came from the moon. What do they feel when they are isolated, and how we can learn to live on the moon? So I'll ask them to answer. Now, in order to make our place as well, we are trying to build places on Earth so that we have a very similar environment like on the moon, so that we can prepare ourselves. And also we will try to look at different areas on the moon where you can develop scientific activities, but eventually also exploit the ice that we have discovered on the moon, ice bases, life support system, and even start some activities for manufacture and also for living. So my personal plan is in 20 years to retire on the moon. I have a beautiful, a small outpost that will be facing the Earth, and I will try to look at you every day with this beautiful planet, the Earth, which is big in the sky, very bright, that rotates on itself. And I want to invite all my friends from Ars Electronica to visit me because we will have made a place out of that. So now let's ask Damien. He's part of this team that spent 1 week isolated like on the moon. What did you feel, Damien? Yeah, you're good.
Oh, hello. Okay. Hello. So we have just finished our mission around 7 this morning. So it was a bit complicated to stay in a shuttle and to don't see the sun, but we have a very overrun schedule, so we don't like quite intention to that, and we are like focused on our task, so it was okay to do that. So, but we was looking forward to seeing the sun, of course.
Yeah. Now I want to say something. They have made a beautiful video that we will release soon, and there was also very interesting experiments. There were 6, but they had a couple, so a romantic couple, and there were different relationships within the crew, and it's a very rich experience. What type of life you could have in such environment to start with. So that's what we experienced on the moon.
Well, that's great. I would like to follow up on a question, Bernard, about that. So there's Dorian Sagan, who's Carl Sagan's son, right? Who wrote a book proposing that the Earth was using humans to reproduce itself, you know, and that perhaps we would end up that the imagination that we have about the future of space and habitation is actually like a kind of premise or a kind of an idea of how we will live on Earth in the future. So what he's saying is that we may never go to the moon or Mars, but we will end up living as if we were on moon or Mars on Earth. So with the pandemic, like the COVID-19, I think we got some sort of idea about this. So I don't want. I would like to ask you: do you think the kind of projects that you're doing are helping to like naturalize this technology so that in 50 years from now, it's going to be normal for everybody to live isolated in their cramped space without the sun? Or I'm just wondering, you know, like, do you foresee also these kind of commercial applications as, you know, like really like transforming the Earth in the image of the moon or in the image of Mars?
So there's something special about Earth's moon, is that, you know, like on the Earth, you have various places. It's a beautiful planet, and there are such a diversity. So you have a diversity of experiences and of opportunities. And in this sense, the moon is just one additional continent. It's so close to us. It will be part of the Earth's sphere. And so it will allow to have some activities there in all areas. It could be scientific, technical, economical, but also artistic, humanitarian. It's our neighborhood, our suburbs. So we'll have activities there. But of course, most of the people will stay on Earth, but we will use this ability to have this continent very close to develop something to the benefit of humanity. So that's a positive scenario. There's also the nightmare scenario, is that, for instance, there is a catastrophe on Earth, asteroid hitting the Earth, or nuclear war. So eventually, you could have a repository of life on the moon, like a Noah's Ark, that we could protect and then save the biosphere. But okay, let's concentrate on the positive scenario. The moon has 8 continents and the suburb of the Earth, with plenty of opportunity to expand our horizon, but also to give us a new start to work, like they have done, an international environment. They go across culture, they create together, so they explore this frontier of humanities. So maybe Damien, you want to add something on that?
Yeah, what you said about if it's like it's this experiment can bring something to the moon of like the future moon base. I think yes, because we are a very overrun schedule. We work a lot of pretty cool experiments. Because of me, I work on growing plants in microgravity, and also growing plants in different type of soil, so moon-like regolith and Martian-like regoliths. So I think, yeah, it will be a help for the future.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Excellent. Yeah. Good to have some astronaut to ask. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. We can't wait for you to come to Canada to join you. We'll find a place in Canada, like coming soon to your channel, right? But now I think to wrap up this session, I don't know if Emiliano, you had a question, but I think Alice has one last question for, and Guillaume too, but we'll go with Alice for Philippe and Isabelle first, and then we'll finish with your question. Okay.
Emiliano wants to say something? Or?
I don't know, I asked him if he wanted to, but he didn't unmute, so I think it's fine.
Okay.
It's fine, I can ask later, don't worry.
Well, if you want to ask one now, Emiliano, you can go ahead.
Oh, it's fine, thank you.
Okay. Alice?
Okay. Well, thanks for this super interesting discussion. I'm curious, Isabelle and Phil, about some aspects of your capsule, because Guillaume and I worked a lot on the question of operative images in the past. We were part of a group together working on that question. And you know, in your capsule, you have top views of like wasteland, waste sites, and so on, that are like cutting like sharp frontiers in the land. And I'm curious, and maybe you'll think my question is super shallow. I'm questioning about the use of colors, because operative images are images that are meant that are produced by machine and meant for machines, and that happen at like a speed that like goes so fast that it's not meant for human perception. But in your kind of sensory images of wastelands, you've got those super sharp colors that creates frontiers like between those sites and that are clean and those sites that are waste. But when you're on the street level, there is no such kind of like clear boundaries between like okay, this is a dump, this is the street. Like sometimes things blur. So I'm just curious, what other processes do you put forward just to engage with these kind of contested sites and those contested terrain? If you could speak just a little bit more about your practice.
I mean, first off, the colors are all fake in a certain way. So they're all separate channels that are grayscale, and when you add them up together, it creates like those 3 RGB sort of pixelated images, and you have to make sense out of them in a certain way, because they're not like only truly like visible wavelength, they're also like the invisible ones. So sometimes you will have an image and you have to discern what makes sense out of it, and if you don't, well, you're just making colors and you cannot really process what you are seeing. And I think the biggest issue with this kind of technology or the way of visualizing is that it limits a real like in-person scenario of being in the place where like you mentioned, colors don't appear in the same way and you don't actually experience the place in the same way. And for example, regarding Lachenay landfill near Montreal, which is getting fuller and fuller, if you see it from above, it seems to be totally fine, but then there's this lack of almost like terrestrial penetration to see what's happening underneath. And in a certain way, what satellite imagery tends to show is like this like God trick view where like you would totally understand what's happening, but then there's like this lack of true understanding. I don't know if you wanted to add something.
Well, yeah, it's a very interesting question, and I think that's why we try to engage with this like layers of different meanings ascribed to different datas. And we were still kind of hopeful to find a way to integrate this in more DIY practices, more like in community-based approaches. So we haven't really shown that in the capsule, but I think our take is also that those borders that are shown are also ways for communities perhaps to access data in safer ways. Like we think that some interfaces we've used are still accessible and are still providing access for communities to kind of make sense of something that is invisible in real life. That is, but we too, like we agree with so much with what Lise said in the capsule, and we're really like still debating about how we want to integrate this. And I think that's why it's a very great question.
Yeah, I think it's important to keep the controversy open, right?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
If we resolve it, then we fail at our project. Well, thank you. Thanks everyone for this first part. I think we'll take a really short 3-4 minutes break, and then we'll come back with Guillaume, Emiliano, and myself. So, yeah.
Petite dernière question.
On n'a pas beaucoup de temps en fait.
Bon, on pourra la poser à la fin.
In the second part, okay, we are trying to address or continue the concerns that we raised in the first section. So I think there will be some crossover questions, but with a more specific focus on urbanization and communities. Okay, so we asked what kind of new gazes the city, what kind of new gazes on the city does space technology enable? What kind of social habits can they trigger? What kind of new urban values can they give rise to? And what kind of new habitats and forms of inhabitation do they make possible? So I'm gonna start with a short clip from, again, Out of the Present, this movie I showed you before. Il n'y a pas de son? Ouais, ok.
Здравствуйте. Добрый день. Добрый день, Николай. Я хочу сказать, что наш тут экипаж смешанный международно беседует с вами сейчас. В ЦУПе, обновленном ЦУПе. Я имею в виду, что карта ЦУПа уже обновлена, Прибалтика выделена в другой цвет. Курилы, краски уже готовят заменить на другой цвет. Ребята, вопрос такой, для короткого ответа. Что на Земле больше всего вам нравится? Оттуда, из космоса. Наверное, то, что мы не видим. Нет, нам нравятся люди на Земле. К сожалению, мы их отсюда не видим.
I think it's interesting to see that what they want to see the most is what they can't see. So like they bring us back to these regimes of visibility about what is made visible and what is made invisible. So part of that was my entry point for my, my short presentation. I think part of the premise for me or the motivation behind this project is that when we look at space imaginaries or space in general, besides Bernard, who brings us so many people, we often see landscapes deprived of people. We either focus on human factors and humans living together, or like on the environmental conditions, but bridging the two is sometimes very hard, or we don't see that often. So this is part of the challenge here. What would it mean to community, that communities engage with space technology? So, and I think it's interesting too to see that the Russian Spatian Mir translates into English as world, peace, and village. And originally it was a word that referred to Russian peasant community that owned their own land. So then it was replaced by a nation state, a concept of after the Russian Revolution for state-owned land. But I think it's interesting to see that the words we ascribe to the places where we live, place binding is really important with the vocabulary that we use. Part of the thing I think for me that is problematic with the appropriation of space technology is that space technology are some sort of continuation of a military logic. So we often use lots of like the television or other stuff like that were developed for military interventions, and this is at this intersection, and I'm trying to see what kind of community engagement can bypass perhaps military limits. Eyal Weizmann here, we heard about in your capsule, he says that because satellite images render people invisible, because Eyal Weizmann is going to point out to the gap in the resolution of images where US Navy have access to very high resolution images where they can actually see people, as civilians have access to very much different resolution, and this creates some sort of inequalities. For forensic architecture, this move, so instead of focusing on trying to see people, they have moved their gaze to look at buildings and to look at buildings for creating evidence. So this is what we see, that because satellite images render people invisible, the scale of analysis shifts to architecture or the environment. So this is at this intersection that I'm trying to ask the questions today. So this is it, the art is coming into focus with this, and this is what he says: the pixel resolution of contemporary publicly available satellite images is not only a product of optics, data storage, or bandwidth capacity, but of legal regulation that bear upon political and even geopolitical rationales. So again, Lisa Parks tells us that today, drones or satellites are used not only for military reconnaissance and targeting killing, but also for disaster relief, firefighters, police units, journalists, and even Hollywood productions. So she says that today it's increasingly difficult to distinguish media and communication from militarization. So how can we subvert this in the city? How can we subvert space technology so that we are not just like continuing military logics in the way we engage with them? So I wanted to bring an example, maybe that we can discuss to see where does it stand in relation to the commons or the sharing of the city and the possibility to create community. So as we saw in the first section, there was some sort of ecological way of understanding space. So like going to space, kind of like Peter Anker explains that going to space created this idea that we started to have the ideology of recycling because we went to space. So we adapted space technology to better live on Earth. So we use the framing of nature in terms of lives in space cabins, he writes, enable an ecological ethic for humans on Earth, model on the scientifically manageable astronaut. So I'm trying to see, like, we transform bio-toilets, solar cells, recycling, and energy-saving devices to general use from space. Now, how can we adapt space technology? So against the backdrop of the commercialization of space, contemporary telecommunication infrastructure are I cannot see this word every time I try. Deterritorializing the notion of a city. By moving to locations outside of the Earth, they impact the distribution of space on Earth. So this relocation is linked to a reduction of public spaces on Earth and to their prevalent privatization and constant surveillance. So urban development, like space settlement, is driven by the commercial sector and marked by the loss of importance of public space. So how then can we create spaces for collective expression through the existing urban structure? So this is part of the question, and here I'm giving an example. So in an article published in Wired, Marcelo Soares tells us the story of Brazilian truck drivers who have hacked American satellites. In the mid-1990s, Brazilian radio technicians discovered they could jump on the UHF frequencies dedicated to satellites in the Navy fleet satellite communication system. So these hackers use high-performance antenna and homebrew gear to turn US Navy satellites into their personal CB radios. Okay, so this is known as the FlatCom, provide better range and sound than amateur radios. So Soares writes, truck drivers love the birds because they provide better range and sound than amateur radios. Rogue loggers in the Amazon use the satellites to transmit coded warnings when authorities threaten to close in. Drug dealers and organized criminal factions use them to coordinate operations. So the satellites, they are called Bollinger or Little Bald, he explains, is a real national phenomenon, okay? So this satellite was used by the Navy, okay? They were using 23 channels by every branch of the US Armed Force and the White House for encrypted data and voice. So the thing that is kind of a little bit of a challenge with that is that let's say that the Brazilian truckers hacked the satellites to listen to football. Usually, like, this is what they say, it's Ronaldo who had scored the goal. But at the same time, if like a military person in the field would want to access the satellite and get in communication, so if the frequency is saturated, that could create an international problem. So this is where we see that civilian occupation is always linked to military interventions. So what the outcome of this, and one of the funny things too is that the author explains that all the gear can be bought near truck stop for less than $500. And also, like, they have ads on specialized websites to perform the conversion for less than $100. So this is very accessible technology, and what happened is that the Brazilian authorities arrested, they called it the Operation Satellite, and so they arrested 39 people because of that. So part of the question, and perhaps this bridges to what you were saying before, is that in this context, who owns the city? Who owns the cosmos? These satellites are in the GEO stationary, in the GEO orbit, and they are above Brazil. So like they cannot use them, but they're still part of their geography. So these are questions that I think are very present for us in terms of community engagement. So if community engagement necessarily means military continuation or illegal activity, we are faced with not much possibilities. So that's a little bit of this idea. So I'm trying to see how can satellite hacking or satellite appropriation could reinvent what we mean by commons, ownership, and control of territory, okay? So part of the deal in this context, that's why we invited Emiliano to be part of the project, because these questions are the questions that urbanists are the best to answer. And so we're trying to have this conversation with Emiliano too. So this perhaps is my question. Who owns the cosmos and how to devise strategies of cohabitation is the work of urbanists. So I'm asking perhaps Emiliano, what do you think? What do you think of these kinds of interventions? Do you think they hold the potential for community-based organizations to or communities to actually engage critically, or these kind of strategies for you are already outdated in the city? So that's going to be it for my part. Then we'll move to Emiliano, and then we'll finish with your capsule and then questions. Thank you.
So Marie-Pierre, can I intervene directly to this easy question?
Yes.
So who owns the cosmos? I don't know if as a terrestrian we have the right to ask that question, because I guess it's a question that we should ask also to other civilizations that probably inhabit this cosmos. I see that Bernard is kind of skeptical, but it's a large cosmos anyway. So it's already large, the galaxy, let alone the cosmos. But I must say that I'm a bit shattered by all this presentation. I think it's been fascinating, but also over the past 15 years, I've been dealing with projects with mostly on planet Earth. In some case, I've been working, projecting a bit in the future, and in some cases even in outer space, but mostly I work with fragile communities on this planet. And so when we talk about outer space in the city, of course, it puts under tension my entire notions of what I know and how I usually act. And I think in a way, this is the interesting part of such a project, because it just enlarges the spectrum of what we intend and how we imagine a place we inhabit. And I think that in general, in our work, we always had the objective to empower communities to take the city in their hands. So it is not an easy task, because usually urban communities, and in general, so we're talking about the majority of the world's population, live under a sort of spell. And the spell is called neoliberalism. So under the spell, we convinced ourselves that in order to make a city, we need to create private profit. Otherwise, apparently, we will not be able to decide and build our future. So namely, profit, I think, is not a terrible thing itself, but however, it's dangerous when we start seeing it in the scale of values, profit as more important of human beings, of basic rights, or of the environment. So therefore, when we talk about outer space in the city, we're starting a new form of imagination, if you want, a new exercise. And it's a necessary exercise because we want to start looking at a new paradigm. And this new paradigm, it's a fundamental reference to start a process in which we can hold on a new imagination of how we might want to live. I was mentioning a few days ago with Marie-Pierre on the phone about this novel that I always find fascinating, that is called Red Star. And it's a novel written by a Russian novelist called Alexander Bogdanov in 1908. And it's a science fiction novel about communist society on Mars. So it's set up in early Russia during the 1905 revolution, and additionally on a fictional socialist society on Mars. So the novel tells the story of a Russian scientist and a revolutionary, of course, who travels to Mars to learn and experience their socialist system and to teach them about Earth, about how he lived. So in this process, he becomes enamored of the people and the technology and of this new world. And in fact, it's the entire novel. It's a strategy to describe the possibility of communist society in another planet. So this novel had a tremendous impact on the young Russian intelligentsia at the time, because it helped them imagine how this society could look like. So in fact, what are the opportunities behind seeing our environment or surroundings and extending in outer space? So I think our power to conceive our environment will form directly the way we live a place. So the ownership that we feel and the way we cohabit a place. So in a way, this is how we worked in a project that we did in Milan, because we were working with a commuter area, so a society that a neighborhood that used to be a quite wealthy neighborhood in the 60s and progressively became poorer and poorer. And the problem was that this neighborhood was hoping for the municipality at a point to help them and to invest. But the municipality inevitably invested in the expo, in making a new stadium, in restoring downtown, in making a new fair, but will never invest in this area. So how do we imagine an improvement for this neighborhood? Needed to start from a process of ownership and a kind of a necessary exercise in imagination to understand that this place was doomed to be left alone. And so people need to put their own strength to improve it. So we did a project that was called R for Republic and started a republic in this neighborhood so that we could understand that we were secluded from the outer help, and we needed to develop our own republic, our own society. And this ended up in the idea to build a parliament. And to make a parliament and to make new laws, we actually asked children from a school that had 95% immigrant population. So the problem was that for the kids, it was really difficult to imagine how things could improve. So we decided to build a time machine to bring them in the future, and through the future to tell the present how society can be improved. And so I'll show you a very quick video about this. So what I found interesting about this kind of exercise is that we had to, in a way, also devise a new language, because also the kids had even difficulties in communicating among themselves. And so the exercise of seeing the future or outer space are exercises in which we can actually define the possibilities of cohabitation that go beyond the limitations and the borders that we currently see. So that's why I think that it's always quite dangerous when we install a certain critique before we start installing a certain level of a process of imagination, because sometimes we just limit ourselves into a condition that is too earthly, or sometimes is even limiting beyond the limitation that we have here now. So here you see some of the kids that were communicating through a new language, and that in a way were establishing new rules to define a different level of society. So, but beyond this, I think that we have to understand, first of all, how do we define a more awareness, and how do we define a level of participation among citizens to define the data politics that shape our digital economy? Because at this point, we see that all these technologies that are being installed in the first outer space are in fact mostly used in a commercial way. So as I think the work that was presented before was presenting, we need to see how to awake, of course, a critical consciousness and a common construction in this arena. So, and how to put eventually technology at service of people and instead of against people. So I think that in ultimately, we could go on this extensively, talking about economies of solidarity, collaborative and digital economy. But I would actually like to end with a quote from David Harvey that was already quoted before, but that goes a bit beyond the level of appropriation of the right to the city. When he says, the right to the city is far more than the individual liberty to access urban resources. It is a right to change yourself by changing the city. It is, moreover, a common rather than an individual right, since this transformation inevitably depends upon the exercise of a collective power to reshape the processes of urbanization. the freedom to make and remake our cities and ourselves is, I want to argue, one of the most precious yet most neglected of our human rights. So I think that after all, what is really interesting about the possibility of going beyond this earthly condition is that it allows us to open on the imagination on how actually we want to inhabit Earth. So once we'll visit Bernard doing his retirement on the moon, we might want to try to use also that opportunity to look back at this planet and understand what are the conditions that actually would make this planet better. And in fact, start investing in these very conditions right now, once that we see that the environment is going mad through the our own kind of environmental destruction. And I think we're becoming disenfranchised and are not able anymore of defining better conditions for living together. So again, let's look at outer space to look back to the Earth and start, a new society right away.
Bernard is in too. Thank you so much, Emiliano. You brought some very powerful things to make us think. No?
Yeah, totally. But I think it's time for Guillaume's.
Oh yeah, it's Guillaume's capsule now. Sorry,
yeah.
I thought it was a discussion section.
No.
So we'll move to Guillaume's capsule and then back.
Invented the word la ville radieuse. La ville radieuse, la ville radieuse. I have invented the word la ville radieuse. La ville radieuse. Radieuse.
thanks to all the presenters for the second part of the roundtable. I think Emmanuel, you have a question before we.
Well, I have it's a very rather general question that is, in the first part of the panel, we're talking about familiarization and access to imagery and appropriation of that imagery, whereas in this second part, there was a discussion about accessing the technologies, hacking these technologies, and these technologies that are predominantly or first developed for military or space exploration. And I was wondering, can we foresee that seeing the trend, the past trends of appropriation of civilians, by civilians, of military purpose technologies, is there hope? Can we foresee that eventually we will have access to these technologies, just like we have now access to the internet, to VR, and to all other technologies?
For me, part of the problem is that we have access to these technologies when they're already naturalized or domesticated. So it's really difficult to bring some iterations or affordances. So that's why I think the work that Bernard does, for instance, is very important, because he brings artists in the space agency, forcing space scientists and engineers to rethink some of the basic assumptions. So I think more and more people like you need to get involved into that. So this is why I was so interested in Emiliano's work, because I think Emiliano also does this kind of he creates these places where different habits, customs, and specializations can coexist. And then it's not giving a kind of prescription of how it should work, but really paying attention or being attuned to the process as it goes on. So I think it's really important, but in the near future, I have to say I don't see light.
Someone wants to pick up on this dark sentence?
Well, then I have hope, so I'm just going to say that hopefully we as artists and designers are getting used to embarking earlier and earlier in the appropriation of these technologies. And I mean, I think we can expect to be part of the process earlier on.
I'd like to just make a little comment about this. So Laurie Anderson was a kind of an artist in residence at NASA years ago, and one of the big guys of NASA. Look at the budget, probably compared to the US budget, right? The shuttle budget, probably very small amount of money, but it was scandalized to see that public funds would go to fund art. So since that event, thanks to Laurie Anderson, but I think it's a fun story, no artists are allowed in residence at NASA. Now they call them visual strategists or other things like that, but they're not allowed to be called artists. So I have a student of mine who was a visual strategist at NASA, and they refused to call her an artist because of that story. So it's interesting, but it's also artists are used to embark on early, but they will need determination and support, people like Bernard for achieving this. Yeah.
Thank you. It's really interesting to see how this kind of business culture has just kind of digested art practices. I think that Isabelle, you had a question for Guillaume.
Yeah, I think it brings us back to the question you asked Bernard earlier about the state of not being completely on Earth and not completely in space. I was specifically struck by the way you described verticality as being stuck in a kind of purgatory when bringing forth the vanities and melancholy state of seeing a blocked or impossible future in our present. And I was just wondering, as artists, or what are we supposed to do in that state of constant floating? How do you...
Quelqu'un d'autre, déjà, je ne sais pas trop si je parlais de purgatoire, c'est une connotation déjà très religieuse, puis aussi pour le coup assez négative.
I'll translate loosely. So basically, Guillaume says that he doesn't know if he's talking about purgatory because it has this kind of negative connotation. Yeah.
Je le vois plus comme une condition d'être au monde aujourd'hui.
Like a way of being in the world, a condition for.
Et plus comme une manière déjà de le saisir, de le percevoir et de développer justement aussi des stratégies de vivre ensemble et qui tiennent compte de ces conditions. Parce que c'est vrai que cette infrastructure de vision planétaire n'est pas tout le temps visible, enfin je dirais même qu'elle est plutôt dissimulée. Donc c'est comment aujourd'hui on doit composer, juste littéralement composer avec cette condition d'existence décollée de la surface terrestre. Donc je ne le vois pas comme quelque chose de négatif, mais plutôt comme une condition dont il faut avoir conscience. Voilà.
Okay. Being more conscious of that kind of a condition of being, not something negative.
Yeah, not looking at it as a negative
Yeah,
point of departure, but
Voilà.
as an invitation.
Et en tant qu'artiste, moi je le vois justement comme une donner à voir, donner à voir, donner à voir, donner à vivre des expériences.
Render visible, sensible.
Voilà.
Experience and activate different experiences.
Voilà, et
activiser. Well. And if I can pick up on this last idea of activating new experience, I think it bridges nicely with what Emiliano mentioned about trying to create new processes of governance, both in the city and in communities and perhaps in space. So I'm just curious, and I have this question for you, Emiliano, where you work with communities and you use different strategies to engage citizens in different issues and speculate with them and think about futures. Well, at least in the project that you showed, but the same way we can speak about space with big S, communities are granular and they're varied and they're diverse, and I'm just curious about what kind of different processes do you engage with when you work with communities? You mentioned an example with kids, developing new language, thinking future forward. Can you? And I think my question is also for Bernard. What kind of micro governance process can we put together in space, and what kind of new alternative models of governance can we invent? So first, I'm curious, Emiliano, if you can describe other strategies, technique you use to engage with publics, because in the end, when you work with communities, it's also micropolitics. There's no kind of universal solution, and I'm curious to see how can these models be translated or adapted for space.
Well, it's an interesting question. Of course, in fact, it changes very much from one community to the other. So there's no fixed model, because usually what happens is that we are trying to develop strategies of interaction, both from citizens within themselves, with local associations, organizations, etc., but also with local governance. The problem is that in most cases, governance is not listening to the local knowledge on the street level. So we're lacking that kind of communication, and usually government thinks that they know what people need, and in fact they don't, and they don't necessarily understand what are the resources, the knowledge resources that people have on the ground, and then can be used to make to change the city. So I think that's something that probably Bernardo sees a lot, because he has a community of specialists that are chosen for their specific qualities. And each community probably has specialists, has people that hold a specific knowledge. It's just that we need to establish a process to enhance this knowledge and put it in the hands of the entire community, and not just hold it on one's private garden. And this also goes in the necessity. I think it's also in respect of what you were saying about access to this kind of technologies, is that all of us is not only artists, we're all citizens. And in fact, most of the data that is used with sometimes private investment, but it's mostly using data on our own planet. And in most cases is also using data that is our private data. And we see this a lot when we're actually monitored as users on the internet for our habits and the way we buy things, for instance. So all of this is data that is used in a private way, but in fact is data that we as citizens of this planet are producing. And so I think that one fundamental fight should be to have free access to data that belongs to us as residents of this planet, rather than to companies that are establishing a technology to exploit it.
Well, this kind of free, open access to information and I would say open governance model is super interesting. I would be curious to to hear Bernard discuss. Because it's really interesting. Emilio, you mentioned the science fiction book where they develop a new socialist model in space. I'm just curious, Bernard, like on a day-to-day basis, how do you develop like micro-governance model in your camps and your analogs? How does that work?
So yeah, we are beyond science fiction now, and I would say, because you have to be provocating, military budget, yes, if you use them to develop these technologies that serve Earth and the citizens. So I don't know, you have an agreement between countries, they have to spend 2% on military budget. Okay, give them the 2%, we cannot change that, but they can use that for research, for, for benefits, for monitoring the Earth, because now you have to do a very big effort of space for Earth. Space for Earth that include one thing, for instance, we cannot live without space. I can switch off all the satellites for one day, and you will be all so unhappy because you depend on it for all your daily life. And so we cannot switch. And these technologies, they have been funded partly by a military budget, but for civilian purpose. And now we have even a bigger challenge. We have to monitor the Earth. And now we have a great asset of satellite monitoring the Earth for climate, also for cities, sustainability. But more important, and I would also subscribe to the fact that we have to give access to citizens, not only to the data, but to the way to use the data for their purpose. And it's not only the governments, they have companies now, they are providing free data, but we need to invest in education of the public, of the young stuff, so that they can also use this data for benefit, to generate also some economical activities, but also there's so much benefit in applying some new analysis techniques, also artificial intelligence with safe bonds to serve our society. So that's something where on the area of data, we have to apply some responsible governance. Now, in terms of, we were talking about property of technology, of data, or even of land. We have been, I think there is, maybe you can say there is no hope, but there is the fact that luckily in 1967, countries passed the Outer Space Treaty, which forbids the militarization of space. It forbids to have nuclear weapons in space. It forbids to have own properties on the moon and celestial bodies. This allowed to avoid conflict of territories, and because the risk was so much that we could have a nuclear war, interplanetary war. So luckily, all these countries had, in fact, the wisdom to prevent this to happen in outer space. And I would say that this is a good model that we have to follow. Now, there was a question also that's for Emiliano, so about we cannot own this lands, we cannot own the space, but we have to be responsible. So no, at the moment, the country that launched the spacecraft is responsible to what happened, and it should not also create collision with other satellites. And also, we have to be responsible in the way we could use some resources. And for instance, we found that on the moon, you can exploit resources like water ice or very rare earth element that would allow us to have a sustainable base, maybe first research and then a bit broader, and without wasting resources from launching from Earth. We have also the possibility to use some resources from asteroid to live off the land. But I think that the main resources we can invest in is the resources of education, science, technology, of having a citizen that knows more about space and science, and they get more responsible in making the choices in their also daily life. And so that's how we want to use space.
That's great, Bernard. Thank you. So we have 10 minutes left, and I'd like to ask a question to both of you wrap up with, to continue with that. So Bernard, when you said that, I didn't want to say that I have no hope for the future of space exploration, but I just want to say that we have to be aware that some of the technologies that we use were invented for military purpose, and that we have to be aware of these. But my question for you, Bernard, is that if we are to use military budgets and we have to let the commercialization of space, so who should own the geo? If it's funded by the military, should it be a nation-based thing? Who should own that? How should we divide it in the terms of the micropolitics that Alice was talking? And following up with that, I would like to ask you, Emiliano, when you said that perhaps it's not for us to ask whom the cosmos belongs to, but in your own terms, who owns the city? Thank you.
Yeah, so the law of space is so much simpler than the law of the surface of the Earth. So Emiliano, good luck. Yeah, the law of space, we own the satellites that we built and we launch, but we are responsible with what we do. So we are responsible that satellite is not going to create damages, and the benefit that we have from this data, is for those people that have invested in building this satellite. And we don't own the orbit. We just own the satellite. And so we don't own the ocean, but I own the ship that goes on the ocean, and I try to avoid to collide with other ships. Now there was a question: can I use some resources of the ocean? Yes, I don't own the ocean, but I can go fishing. So that we can agree to make good use, so to be a good customers without owning the place. And now I have no problem, as I said, give me a lot of military budget. I have no complex if you use it for the good cause. I mean, the military they are there to protect, and so so now we have techniques by surveillance from space that we allow, for instance, to monitor in advance situations that will be very dangerous. Like, for instance, we monitor from space and with artificial intelligence how crops grow, how water is managed, and this way we can predict better if there will be a risk. So we acquire the data, but now we have to use this data and with the deciders so that we have to solve the problem on Earth. So I think that for this, space is a much more asset than it represents risk, because also we have prevented the risk of warfare using space.
Thank you, Bernard. This is great. But now I'd like to see Emiliano. You see, Bernard is dead laughing. Okay, Emiliano.
Well, that's going to be more difficult. But it is true that there's an example in Barcelona that is working quite strongly lately. It's a democratic platform called the Decidim that is owned by the municipality that does laws for the use of any kind of private information and data of all the users of the city. So that means that every time we go on internet and we are surveilled even on the satellite, all this material is considered belonging to the citizens of the city. And so it goes through local law, the way in which private institutions might use this material. So, I mean, this is a precedent. So there is possibilities of having this kind of regulations. But I think that more interesting in who owns the city, it's interesting because I think each one of us owns a city, because each one of us, through our process of inhabiting, but also imagining a place, we construct an individual city in our heads, in our lives. The thing is that I would mostly ask artists is, do we want to live in a dystopian reality or maybe in an utopian reality? What we're living currently is that we're mostly living in a dystopian reality. We see that media, especially we saw with the current health crisis, we see that entertainment, like with Netflix production and all kinds of movies, are mostly depicting our societies in the worst side. And this is making us more aware of the awful aspects of our reality, without giving us the strength to build on something that can be new. So I'm not saying to not consider the awful things that are happening, because I think that's a base. Those are the roots to construct something different. But we need to start also imagining an alternative in a positive way that can be a blueprint for constructing different relations among people and among our societies. Otherwise, we'll never get to the moon, and we'll never retire in the moon, as Bernard is planning to do.
Thanks, Emiliano. I think my last intervention is much more a commentary than a question, but I think that your response about the kind of new interventions that we have to design, and like the kind of overlapping of different worlds, and asking artists to think about it, bridges nicely with what Guillaume did in his video capsule, and Lee too, and everyone basically, and about like imagining new worlds, but also looking at asking the question: are we really present, and do we have like our 2 feet on the ground, and what does it mean to look above, but to be really present and attuned with what's happening with communities. So on that note, I think I will let Marie-Pierre do the closing remarks, because time is limited.
We're running out of time. We're not on the Martian time, so we don't have 45 minutes extra. So I would like to end these conversations. I would like to start by thanking Isabelle, Philippe, Guillaume, and Lee, and also Alice, Emiliano, and Bernard for joining the conversation. This is one of many iterations of this project, and we hope to see you again, perhaps in person, for the next round. And thanks again to Hexagram and Ars Electronica, and we hope to meet you on Mars or on the moon, Bernard. Huh? So next time we host this event on the moon. You'll find us some military funding, right, to go there?
Yes, that's what we have to use them for. Yes.
Or ask to Jeff Bezos.
Yeah, no Jeff Bezos, no thanks. So thank you very much, everybody, and I wish you a good trip. I don't know to say that, okay? See you in space.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.